Welcome to another episode of the podcast.
Hi.
So abrupt. We hope you enjoyed our last series that we had with our pastor, Ijaz Nabi.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if you would like him to come back, let us know. If there's anything you'd like us to talk about with him, also let us know.
Mm-hmm.
If there's anyone that would like to talk to us on the podcast, also let us know.
Yeah, sure.
I can't guarantee it'll happen, but
Just let us know.
Doesn't hurt. Shoot your shot.
Yeah.
So we are continuing. We're not continuing. We're starting a new series. This month we're talking about Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. I wore my coffee shirt because Hebrews, coffee. It's called Bean to Cost. I got it. They're a Christian.
They're not paid.
They're not a sponsor, but their stuff is still cool. They had really good packaging. She designs it herself. This is her
Did
shirt.
you try the coffee though?
I don't drink coffee. That's why I got a shirt. That's why I didn't buy coffee. But Lex said it was pretty good. They had cold brew samples. Hebrews, coffee shirt. Anyways, so a little backstory on the book of Hebrews, I guess. From what I remember, from what I gather, we don't exactly know who wrote Hebrews. But it was a letter written to, so the whole book is a singular letter written to the Hebrews, right? Written to the Jews that had converted to Christianity, but were facing like difficult times. And I think some of them were like reconverting back to Judaism or something, or they were leaving Christianity because they were undergoing very difficult times. And so that was when this letter, or why this letter was written for them, to them. Do you have any backstory on Hebrews?
Not really.
Okay.
I think you kind of covered everything.
Okay, so I was right. Whew. So for the next 5 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at different chapters, I guess, of the book. From what I gather, also, again, about the book of Hebrews, it's basically talks about who God is, right?
Yes.
Different attributes or different facets to who God is and who Jesus is. So for today, we're going to be talking about the identity of Jesus, basically.
Okay.
So put yourself in the position of the people undergoing this persecution and troubled times. Let's say a letter was being written to you. What would you be looking for, or what kind of encouragement would you need in this letter? Like, if you were to receive this letter, what would you want it to have? I feel like
I get what you're saying. I'm trying to think of an answer.
Okay.
I would probably want. I don't know. Hope that the persecution's gonna come to an end. Maybe a more practical way to escape the persecution. I don't know. Those are two things at the top of my head.
Solid. So I feel like that's valid train of thought. However, the book of Hebrews does not start that way. Instead, it starts with turning everything back to God, right? It starts with like a brief summary of like the theology, right? So we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. And I have it in actually, let me switch to the NIV. Okay, so I have it in the NIV, and it says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven." Is that encouraging? Is that what you would expect or look for from this letter?
If I'm being persecuted, definitely not.
Okay. Why do we think the author started this way? Genuinely, like, what do you think the rhyme or reason was to starting with an explanation of, I guess, who Jesus is and why he came?
Well, okay, so from, I want to say, a more Christian being persecuted point of view, I could understand someone maybe reminding me who is Jesus, like who is the God that I'm serving, I can understand that logic to a certain extent. Because even to when Jesus himself came, right? People expected him to be this sort of like military leader in a sense of he's gonna like lead an actual revolution
Like
against the Romans.
royalty,
Yeah,
like yeah.
right. Like he's gonna lead the people against the Romans. So, they didn't. Jesus didn't come in the way they expected him to, right? Or they didn't expect the Messiah to come that way. So it follows in track that someone writing what is now one of the foundational books of our beliefs would also not kind of
Start
approach
the
it the way we would expect it to be done.
Yeah, I definitely I feel like with the context that I have of like what Hebrews is supposed to be, I definitely would not have pinned it to start the way that it had. But I also find that a lot of times when I'm going through things, like a lot of times when you're dealing with difficult situations, you tend to forget the truths. Right? Like I know I get in my head and I tend to like think of like I spiral sometimes, right? Surprise.
What?
Who'd have thunk?
Not me.
But I tend to forget like the simple truths, right? Like God is the God of the universe, right? Like he is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, right? He knows it all, he sees it all, he's like done it all, right? And those I feel like are foundational truths. So to turn it back to be like, hey, just to remind you, God spoke to us through these prophets. And then he also sent his son Jesus to also speak to you, right? And then once Jesus did his works, he went back up to be with God. I feel like that it can do a couple of things. It can remind you of those truths that we tend to forget, but it can also be like, hey, God sent his son to talk to you and to set these guidelines and to set like a path that we can follow, right? To lay an example down as to what we can do and how we can respond in these times of persecution. Because for basically Jesus' whole time where he was doing his ministry, he was persecuted by the Romans and the Pharisees. And not once did he rebuke God, right? Not once did he turn away from his father, but instead he turned to him and he reminded people, or he showed people how to act in kindness and act in gentleness despite the persecution and the pressures that he's facing.
Right. Okay.
And so I think that's what I got from the beginning, or from this way of opening with Hebrews. So in order to, I guess, trust in Jesus' word, I think we also have to know them, right? And to also practice it. So in beginning the book like this, I feel like the authors are reminding you, like, Jesus has spoken to us in this way, right? It's important for us to remember, like David said in Psalms, right? I have your word hidden in my heart and I will meditate on it day in and day out, right? And it's kind of, I feel like it's kind of reminiscent of that as well.
Okay. So one of the thoughts I had as you were talking was, I think because you only read up to verse 3, right?
Yep.
Part of me also wonders, right, if we're talking to believers who come from a Jewish background specifically, right, how much of them were maybe somewhat still confused, right? Because now Christianity is drawing a line in the sand from where Judaism, I don't know, stops to a certain extent, right? So part of me now goes, well, is he trying to make sure before we talk about anything else, let's all make sure we're all on the same page, right? Like, this is Jesus, this is who he is. Let's all just come to that. Let's agree on that first before we talk about anything else, right? let's just agree on, because like even with it going from verse 1, in the past God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets, that's the Old Testament, right?
Yep.
That's what the Jewish people are used
they
to,
know,
right? So
yeah.
he's like, okay, the same God that spoke to them, right, has spoken to us now by his son, right? And is it verse 3? The son is the radiance of God's glory, right? The exact representation of his being. And I think that's also an important thing now, right? God has now moved from just using prophets, and now he himself has come. Like, we need to establish that before we do anything else in the conversation. Yeah.
I didn't think of it in that way, but that also does make sense. I was taking it more so in the way that like God has spoken to us through these prophets, and now he sent his son, which is like the prophet of prophets, basically. So if we're like going off of what you're saying, right, a lot of these new Christians have Jewish backgrounds. So if they're holding on to what the prophets have said before Jesus, then I think basically setting the standard that Jesus is the one above them all, right? So if you're going back to what these previous prophets had said, it's that much more important that you hang on to what Jesus had, like the example and the word that Jesus has left for you. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Because I think in this context, it's kind of saying that like, I guess in these times of uncertainty and persecution and stuff, Jesus is the most steady rock that you can rely on, that you can rest on, because he is God's son that was sent to give this example for us. That's kind of the lens that I've been looking at it at.
Okay.
So with that, because I'm going like with the fact that Jesus is the rock and he is the one that we are to rely on, I would ask, why is it important to have someone that we can trust when we're going through these times, when we have these difficulties?
Well, I mean, I can't remember which series we were talking about or what month it was, and we were talking about, I want to say we were talking about who God is, and one of the things I think it was with the names of God, and one of the things we talked about was God being everlasting, right? And sort of meaning that, hey, he is this unending source of whatever, right? Love, power, like whatever it is that you need.
Yeah.
And I think when you're going through situations, right, whether it's persecution or whatever you're going through in your life, being reminded that God is this rock, right? God is this where's the line? Sustaining all things by his powerful word, right? Like there is sustenance in God, right? And I think when you're going through it sometimes, it's, as you said, right, we forget these simple truths. And I think it's important for us to remember that in bad situations, in dark situations, and unpleasant situations, we serve a God who is able to sustain us because he's eternal, right? Like he's not going to run out of resources, right? That's why, as you said it, he's the rock, right? We're not going to use up all the resources he has, and now he's in the same boat as us.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
I agree.
Awesome.
I think along with the sustaining part, I think it's also that God is steady. He's very consistent. It's not like one day he'll give you more and next day he'll give you less. He gives you what you need for the time that you need it. So it may seem as though, actually I take that back. It may seem as though he's giving you more and giving you less, but he's consistent in that he gives you what you need when you need it. Sometimes you need more than sometimes you need less. But yes, he sustains us consistently and steadily. And I think that's one of the main truths that I know that I tend to forget when I'm going through things, because I think it's easy to put God in like a human lens where it's like, I don't think I can do this, therefore God probably can't. Yeah. But it's like, he's God, right?
Well, like to what you were saying, right? That reminds me of the Israelites when they're in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yeah.
Right? God gives them manna
for the
right?
day.
But he tells them, okay, only take enough that you need.
Mhm.
If they took more, I think it like instantly like
Like-
spoiled and
Mhm.
went like rotten. And I think maybe the day before Sabbath or in preparation for that, that's the only time they took enough for 2 days.
Mhm.
So they didn't have to do like labor
On Sabbath.
on the Sabbath, right? So, okay, right, again, we see this idea that God provides exactly what we need, right? The interesting part about that is that he provides what we need, but obviously there's a portion we often focus on, okay, if you took too much, he would
Destroy.
destroy it. But we, I think, don't often talk about the people who just didn't take enough because they didn't know how much they need, right? And again, right, God is providing enough, but it's on us to make sure we access it the right way, right? And I think that's kind of the flip side, right? Everyone expects abundance from God, right? Because that's the language that gets used, and I think we misinterpret abundance, right? But yet we see here in this very practical way, God is abundant, yet he's not overindulgent in that sense.
Yeah.
Right? Yet I'm sure there were people who, in trying to not be overindulgent, underserve themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And I do wonder, and I'm sure God had some solution for that, right? And I'm sure they were still sustained and they had enough to eat and they didn't starve or anything like that. But it's interesting to me that God, I don't want to say punishment, but God had a plan for overindulgence. But if you didn't take enough, that's just on you.
I think with regards to the people that probably didn't take enough, it's one of those things that you have to learn from, right? So like God provides every single day, or provided every single day. So if you didn't take enough this day, then and you went through what you had, then you knew for the next time to take more or to take, as needed. So I don't think necessarily God would have had to step in if people undertook.
Fair.
Because at that point, that's a lesson that you need to learn. You need to know how much you need from God. You need to understand that. I guess I was when you were talking, it took me back to your identity, right? My identity in Christ. I need to know who I am in God to know how much I need and how much I deserve and what I'm entitled to as a child of God. And I think if you don't have that identity or don't have that knowledge, then it's hard for me to know how much I should or shouldn't take or how much I will need or won't need from him at this given time.
Yeah, because then I'm probably way off topic at this point, but
Yeah.
let's just go.
The moment you
right?
started talking about them.
Because then now I get reminded of the prodigal son,
Yeah.
who takes everything he's entitled to,
Yeah.
but now doesn't know how to keep it, and then loses it. Like it's really the same thing, right? It's just God provides. It's what do we do with the provision, right? And I think again, like just him, the fact that he's that in verse 3, it says, the Son, right, being Christ, is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, which we didn't even talk about, but then it ends it with sustaining all things by his powerful word, right? After he provided purification for sins, he sat on the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. But like that sustaining all things by his powerful word, that also goes back to just creation, right? God spoke creation into being, right? And it's that same voice that the writer here is saying can sustain all things, right? And we can look to him for that sustenance. And I think it's a really powerful verse when you kind of see all the examples that God has given of, I can provide for you. Like that's not an issue. The real issue is what do we do with his provision? Yeah.
I think that also goes back to being a good steward. Right? Because if I'm a good steward of what God has given to me and trusted me with, just like the master with the talents, right?
Yeah.
If I know how to manage the things that you have given me, you will reward me with more. If I am a poor steward of those things you've provided me, you will give me less. Or there will be a punishment for it because I have fallen short. And I think that also goes back to knowing who God is.
Yes.
And not just knowing who God is, but knowing who God is for you, like your personal relationship with him. Because some people might look as though they have more, but their walk is different from my walk, right? Their experiences and their opportunities have been different from mine.
Yeah.
The things that I have been rewarded with may not look the same as theirs. But that doesn't mean that God has been any less of a provider for me versus them.
100%.
I'm trying to think of how to put this back on track. Okay. Okay. I think okay. So in Hebrews, right? Going back to Jesus is the rock, he is the one that we are to rest on, right? And he is the provider. He provides our sustenance and he keeps us in these times of persecution, right? I think it's important to look back on the life of Jesus that he has, like the example he set for us, right? So, like I said before, in order to trust Jesus' words, we have to know them and we have to practice them, right? So we have to practice what he's preached, basically. I feel like that's a common expression, or I guess something that's taught to practice as Jesus preached, basically. Just the concept itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Practice what you preach. Yeah.
And so in doing so, are there habits that have helped you learn or practice those habits of Jesus?
Rephrase the question.
What habits help you learn and practice Jesus' teachings? How have you been able to practice?
Yeah. Okay.
How so? Do tell.
Yeah, I think for me, especially having grown up in church, grown up around a lot of seeing a lot of other pastors and things like that. I think for me it's interesting because I don't know if we've had this conversation in the podcast, but I think it's very easy to like play church in a sense, right? But then it's kind of like this little empty shell game. And then at some point, and I really can't tell when, I realized, oh, there is more to this than that. And then at some point it goes, okay, well, there is something to be said about I think just being able to be, let's say, like gentle with people or things like there are certain things that like just I started to just notice, and I was like, oh, this is what the Bible's talking about, right? Like, this is why Jesus sometimes spoke harshly to people and sometimes he spoke very softly to people, right? He, like, again, to the provision thing, people are different. The provision looks different. People are different. The way in which God speaks to people is different, right? And I think for me, there were certain things where I had to learn about just, okay, if I'm going to enter this situation, if I'm going to approach a situation, right, I have to now know, okay, it's not just, I can't just reflect the Jesus that flips tables in the courtyard, right?
It's really tempting.
It is, right? But of all his interactions, he does that one time.
Yeah.
Right? Like we all love to talk about it and we realize how, like, percentage-wise, that's such a small part of the story of Christ. But there's these other situations in which he ignores the more popular person to reach out to the person that's more disenfranchised, or just breaks the social norms to find that one person. And I think once I really started to understand why Jesus approached things sort of the way he did, it made it easier for me on a practical level to now, oh, okay, you're going through this. I think sometimes it's easier to just be like, well, you put yourself in this situation, right? And I was like, okay, it's not a good situation. Let's sit down, let's talk about it, let's pray, let's see what is God saying in this time for you, right? Like it really did kind of just change, I think, the way I approach people. I don't even know if I answered your original question at this point.
We'll go with it.
Okay.
Going back to what you were saying though, I think there's definitely a difference between being like a Bible scholar and being a Christian.
Oh yes, 100%.
And I think that's where I've noticed a big difference, because I know there are a lot of people that can talk about the Bible and that can I wouldn't necessarily say preach, but like explain the Bible or like have conversations about it, but they're not necessarily Christians in that they don't follow the guidelines Christ has set for us in that way.
Yeah.
And that is one of the things I noticed like growing up. There are a lot of people that I know that can preach and teach, but when it comes down to their walk, you can see
Yes.
the difference. And so that kind of also helped me to check myself, because and going back to like practicing the habits of Jesus, it turns me back to like, well, how are you presenting? And not just how are you presenting, but are you purposefully presenting this way, or is this genuinely how you are? Because there's a difference in that as well. Because I can put on a show, like you were saying, of being like this outward appearing Christian, but if my lifestyle outside of that does not present the same way, then it's really just a show you're putting on. And I noticed that it's easy to put on the performance, right? Especially if someone that has grown up in church, it's easy to put on the performance and be involved in all the things and do the things. But when it comes down to walking the walk and like building that relationship with God, it takes a lot more intentionality.
Yes.
And that's something that I've had to learn for myself, because I've always been involved in things, right? And I've always been presenting as someone, but it's different when your heart is in the right place and like your actions behind the scenes are doing the right things.
Yeah. I think at some point when we were talking about either dating or marriage last month, I think we brought up this example of like, there are guys that like, they're very intentional until they get the girl, and then it's like, whatever. It's like I won the game, right? And I think,
Dating episode.
probably, and I think that that's something that applies to like all relationships, right? But I think we don't notice it sometimes with the more casual relationships we have, right? Like friendships, I think we don't notice it as much, right? I think we notice it in the sense that, oh, this is like my best friend, this is my close friend, and we start to put those kind of words on it, because I think when you have someone who is typically you would call like your best friend, or you know, people in like your inner circle, right? There's a certain level of intentionality with those relationships, right? And I think it's kind of the same way with us and God. I think for a lot of people, our relationship with God is very casual. It's a once a week thing on a Sunday. And because of that, because there's no intentionality behind it, we don't really know God the way he wants to be known, right? And again, that goes back to the idea of the provision, right? And are we actually using everything that God has provided, right? Are we taking full advantage of the fact that he has given us his word, and he's made a way for us to freely communicate with him, where we don't have to do an animal sacrifice, we don't have to go to another priest and communicate to God through a priest or anything like that. We can go and communicate to God directly. And I think, again, when our relationship is casual, well, I think the problem a lot of us face is that we want the results of having an intentional relationship with God but we only give him casual. And then we're surprised when we don't get the intentional results. We don't experience God at that level. And we go, well, I was here every Sunday, right? I was here 52 days out of a 365-day year, right? So I think that's where a lot of us, we get tripped up in our relationship with God.
And I think bringing it back to Hebrews,
Okay, 'cause
I
have no
think
clue where I was talking about this, but-
I think when we get into that mindset, when we do fall under these times of persecution and difficulties, it's hard to know how to respond, right? Because you don't have that foundation of that groundwork with God to know that, like, I can ask him for these specific things. I can ask for help in these specific areas. And, like, you know what I mean? Instead of just being like, help, which also, like, that is also a valid prayer as well. But when you have that groundwork and you have a rapport with someone, you know how to speak to them in a way that'll be more effective for the conversation you're trying to have.
Yeah, and like even like for me, like with some of like the close friends I have, right, with like some of the stuff that's happened recently, I remember I was like, hey, do you need help today? And at first I was like, no, I'm good. And or that was gonna be my response. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure I need help today. And I was like, hey, I need help. They're like, all right, cool, we're coming over. Right. And it was one of those things. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, okay. When you have people who are very intentional, you get different outcomes from the relationship. Because the people who I'm casual with, I would never expect them to drop what they're doing and just come and help me with some,
Yeah.
whatever the case is. So I think that's the same thing with us with God. It's hard if we're going through it. If we have a casual relationship with God, it's very hard, I think, to understand that God can even help us in that situation because we don't really know him at that level to say that he can.
Yep.
And I think that's part of the problem when you have a casual relationship with God. You when the situation is not casual, serving God casually doesn't help you anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue that I know, like, I've experienced it where I had a very casual relationship with God, and it's like, hey, this isn't a casual situation. I need more from God in this situation. And I don't know if that's the theological way to say it, but the only way for me to have experienced more from God was to seek more, right? It's there, right? But it wasn't I wasn't ready available to experience.
In the book of Hebrews, right? I think there is an aspect of reminding the people, I guess, or re-explaining to the people who it is that God is, right? Or Jesus is. So I think it's important to remember that in these seasons of hardship, right, in these times of persecution, that Jesus is that rock, right? But he's also the shield. Is that the right phrase? My rock and my shield? I guess
Sure.
we're gonna go with it, right? So not only does he allow us to rest in him, but he also goes before us. And so when you get into these casual cycles, you don't really have the knowledge of how to use this shield. Whereas when you can build that deeper relationship with God, and not only can you rest in him, but you can rely on him, then he can go before you and shift things to the way that they need to be for him to work for in your life. Does that make sense? So basically when you put your trust in God, right, and you have that deeper relationship with him, there's nothing that can separate us from him.
Right.
And then in having that close relationship with him and being like side by side, so to say, like, he can also physically like go before us and make the way and pave the streets for us, if that makes sense. And I think that's kind of where the author was kind of trying to go in Hebrews 1. That is all.
But
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you had more to say.
I didn't know if you wanted to add to
I
anything.
mean, I can keep getting sidetracked if you want me to.
No, I think we're all
Okay.
right. All right, goodbye.